Hi, I'm Michael Lang, and this is another conversation in a series I've called In Their Voices. And today I have the joy and the pleasure of talking to Marina Piscolish, excuse me. Marina, I wonder if you would just introduce yourself, say a little bit about your background and your work, and then we'll get started with our conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. It's really nice to be here with you, and I'm so glad you're doing this series and I get to be part of it. Myself, I am in private practice, and I have been in private practice as a conflict resolution trainer, um, facilitator, mediator, organizational change management consultant. And I have been doing that here in Hawaii on Oʻahu, where I have lived for the most part for the last 22 years. Prior to that, I was at the University of Delaware, and I believe that's during the time that I met you initially. There, I founded and then led the conflict resolution program that is now in the Biden School of Public Administration at the University of Delaware. And prior to that, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. I originally was a classroom teacher to start with. And I came to all of that interested in social studies and social change as a child of immigrants. I think of myself as a child who grew up in an immigrant family. Our identity was largely Italian American. And I say Italian American because I think we identified more with Italian than American. I think the next generation, I think probably the next generation is more American Italian. But I was Italian and Croatian. My dad was a coal miner when I was young, and then, like many immigrants, had a small business that he ran. He and my mom together. Raised in a really tiny town about an hour out of Pittsburgh, but always had big dreams for myself. I can recall that the first time I ever saw the city of Pittsburgh, which was about 50 miles away, I was on my way through the city to the airport, heading to South America to be an exchange student.
Wow.
Been nowhere, but that was my first trip, and that's the first time I was actually seeing city lights.
That's fantastic. What a great introduction. So I'm curious because you've lived in Hawaii now for 22 years, as you say, and worked there. And how has living in what is a different, even though it's part of the United States, as we mainlanders sometimes forget, that it's a different place because of it's such a melting pot of cultures. And I'm just wondering how the experience of living and working in Hawaii has influenced the way in which you do your practice.
That's a good question. I think it's influenced it a lot. And in part is that it took the things I was already interested in or puzzling over or trying to figure out how to, you know, innovate practice to address. And then it stretched it over a different context here. And so it gave me the chance to continue to problem solve about sort of the core dilemmas in the work that I was interested in, but in a context that was quite different from where I had grown up. To be more specific, I did my early work in education settings, and having come from a family of teachers, I was very aware of the culture of schools, the culture of education, the culture of teaching. I was very aware that getting buy-in to conflict resolution required that you be responsive to that culture, that the work you do reflect the realities of that culture. And so I think my early successes came from being very intentional about culture. But in that sense, I would say professional culture, organizational culture, political culture, because frankly, schools are political animals, and those roles and the hierarchies within education have political consequences. And so I've always been designing and building toward the skills needed for democracy with a small d, dialogue, deliberation, quality, consensus building, sort of creating that unifying force. That's always been sort of a major interest to me. So when I come to Hawaii, culture takes on a very different lens. And now we're looking at ethnic cultures, racial cultures, and cultures of historic trauma, colonialism, and other things that are sort of up close and personal right here. The timing of my arrival had a lot to do with that. I arrived here right around the 100th anniversary of the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And it was also about 30 or so years into the civil rights, the sort of the ripple effects of the civil rights movement on the mainland. And so there was a Hawaiian Renaissance, a renaissance of interest in culture, saving the language, saving hula, and rethinking the place that Hawaiians have ended up in their own homeland and the consequences of all that. So early on, I began thinking about what would it mean to be sensitive and responsive to the cultural needs here? What would ethical practice look like? What is my responsibility to build agendas and design approaches that are resonant with people and not just, so here in Hawaii, we have, like, I'd say 3 strong cultures that you see in public spaces: Japanese culture, Hawaiian culture, and what they refer to as haole culture. And I think I began asking the question about who am I designing for, and what are the implications of that? And being here during the anniversary of the overthrow and the push for, questions about sovereignty, reconciliation, repair, reparations are all sort of active conversations here in Hawaii still. And I began to think about, how does my work intersect with that? And so I guess the best way I can describe it is that I began to, what I would call, hybridize my approach. I would work from the context in which I was trained. And I guess I would say that the processes I learned and the skills I gained and the ways I worked were probably pretty influenced by white, Western, and probably often male sensibilities about what organizations are like and how they operate. And coming here to Hawaii, I began to revisit a lot of those underlying assumptions of practice and began to try and redesign trainings, agendas, approaches to be more reflective of what I was coming to understand about Hawaiian culture and even Asian culture, which has a lot of influence here. And so it was more of a weaving. I was bringing what I brought and then looking around and learning what I could and saying, how can I make, I used to describe it as privilege-free facilitation. I do a lot of facilitation and multi-stakeholder facilitation and collaborative process. And in my mind, the picture I have is that, there is a culture to collaboration. In the culture of collaboration and conflict resolution, there is high value placed on verbal expression, willingness to speak up. There are a handful of an assumption of the value of a certain kind of egalitarianism, sort of a flat hierarchy. And those are not consistent with a lot of other racial, ethnic, and regional subcultures. Those are points of view about how things should be done. And so I was really aware of the fact that when I bring these skills into a setting, there's already a lot of culture in the space. And so trying to create a sense of safety for people to sort of hold the spotlight in the center of the room, which is how you get heard very often in facilitated processes. The question for me was, how could I design a process so that everyone in the room had an equal level of comfort leaving their chair and metaphorically making that walk to the center and back, no matter who they were, status-wise, ethnically, racially, positionally. And so I've always been designing for sort of creating that kind of accessibility, inclusiveness, equity in process. And that became especially important as I became more aware of the fact that when you try to facilitate any issue here, especially a public policy related issue, the past is always present. And agendas that don't acknowledge that there are people in the room who are settling this conflict with consideration of and concern for all of the past conflicts and even sort of the larger history of Hawaii's illegal overthrow and, in many people's minds, continuing occupation, that to pretend that that wasn't with us was foolhardy. And so I started really thinking about how do you design processes that make room for that history, for experiences of collective trauma, and for a present day sense that something, while you cannot necessarily right that wrong, you can handle today's challenge or issue or collaboration in a way that seeks not to add further harm, and where possible attempts to acknowledge and heal what can be healed. And so that became a really big focus of my work over the last several years, is inventing new ways of bringing people together and asking them to engage with one another. And I guess the best way I would say it's a kind of a mashup. It's very Eastern and Hawaiian in its collectivist sensibilities, where the group is more important than the individual, where there's a higher value on harmony than truth telling, versus what I think of as sort of the opposite of that from a more Western individualistic culture, where there's a lot of interest in agreement seeking, issue resolution, and less tending to the deeper context of connection and relationship. I also think that Western tends to be more defined by the current moment, rather than looking at that much longer time frame of 7 generations backwards and forwards kind of thing. So there were a number of things about being in this milieu that gave me really creative momentum around rethinking, reinventing how I think about the work, and giving myself permission. That's probably the biggest part, giving myself permission to make stuff up, to do things in ways I had never seen them done. And so I feel as though a deeper understanding of history, a deeper understanding of trauma, a deeper appreciation for the significance of culture, and bringing all that forward in the way I think about the value of these skills, which has only made them seem more valuable to me, because I feel like they are a resting place for us between our cultural experiences, that there's enough in the way we go about conflict resolution that it's accessible to folks from any of these cultures. You know, there's aspects of the processes we teach that resonate with everyone. Maybe not everything resonates with their own culture, but there's enough of their own culture in there. And then it creates some kind of container for us to come together around working through things. So it's been a grand time of experimentation and invention for me, and a really rich context in which to see issues of culture, identity, history, and trauma play themselves out with, you know, what's going on the mainland and in other parts of the world as background. It provides a different frame on it, because we don't have such a strong black-white dilemma that's happening on the mainland. But there are definitely hierarchies of culture and situational privilege and dominant cultural paradigms that operate here, and being able to see through that lens and then think about what might we design and do here in a way that makes sense for who we are and where we are and what's happened here, was a permission that I don't know that had I stayed on the mainland, I would have given myself that kind of latitude to be that experimental.
Well, it's like your trip to South America. You know, you're in a completely different setting, one with traditions, values, practices, rituals, language, all of which are different from what you grew up with and what you learned. So you had to become a student all over again, right?
Absolutely.
So how can you, maybe you can talk a little bit about, because I'm really curious to understand how, because so much of what we teach and practice in conflict resolution is in the moment. It is, what's the conflict that we need to deal with today? And sometimes, yes, even in family mediation, you go back and, you know, a divorce mediation, you go back and you say, well, you know, what's the origin of the dispute? But that's going back a decade or two, not centuries, not generations. So how do you bring that into the room in a way that respects, honors, and invites all of that into the room, and at the same time attending to
get moving?
Right.
Yeah, so another good question. Let me offer like two examples. One being sort of the way I modified the way I think about agenda development, and the other being a more specific way I engaged a multi-stakeholder group of players to confront their history.
Please, yes.
So one of the things I noticed about, as I moved in and out of different circles here, which are sort of dominated by different, cultural assumptions, depending on whose culture dominates in that space, I had the good fortune of being able to have close contact with Hawaiian contexts, cultures, families, groups. And one of the things I noted was that they, put simply, they spent an agenda, which typically start with maybe food, because there's always food. So there's food and connection around food. And then it's often that nothing begins until there's prayer. And so there's some kind of centering process of aspiring. And here, I think the missionaries did a great job of leaving behind some tremendous prayer creators who can do extemporaneous prayer. And, I was raised Catholic, so we do rote recitation prayer. It's scripted, you're not going off road. But here, when people say a prayer, it's often so thoughtful and elaborate about the very specifics of who's gathered and what you're gathered for and what you're here to do. And so all of a sudden you sort of feel this infusion of purpose and meaning about what you're doing together, and a sense of concern and caretaking for each other. So that was a really nice, juicy way to start a gathering. And then very often it goes from there to introductions. And in introductions in Hawaiian settings are often not brief, and they're not just your name and your role. They, Hawaiians themselves have a traditional process of doing introductions that does their whole lineage. So it talks about sort of the family they're from, where their family is from in the islands, how it's moved over time. They may talk about their long Hawaiian names and what all of those name pieces mean. So there's much more time spent in relating to one another. And often, even when they don't do formal Hawaiian introductions in that sense, it's a lot of where my family's from, which island, what high schools we went to, where our cousins are. So you get this sense of everybody's building a network of connections before any discussion of work has happened. And then very often there may be an opening, sort of what might feel like the first agenda item past introductions. It's really, you might even, well, there's often a land acknowledgement. Where are we on this land? What was this land used for? What was its original name? So you make a relationship with the place where you are. You make a relationship with the people that you're with, and you make a relationship with the purpose that you're gathered for, and in aspirational terms, not technical or transactional terms. Like, we're here today to get review of the issues. It's more like we're here to sort of lift this issue up and see if we can get broader support to really solve this problem. So then, after all of that, there may then be a turning to the agenda. But, if I think about a different kind of environment that I might be in, all of that stuff I described, from food to prayer to intention setting to a deeper sense of connecting to each other, to a connecting to the place, almost doesn't happen. Very often in what I would describe as a more formal Western or white environment, people come in, they check their phones, they do whatever they're going to do. Maybe they talk to the few people that they know in the room, and the meeting begins with a hello, maybe a round of name and role introductions, and then a review of the agenda. And the work begins. And what I noticed was, if a meeting, people actually might connect with each other more, like, oh, don't you have a child about my age, or those sorts of conversations. That would happen maybe at the first break, where people are over the break table and grabbing a cup of coffee or something. And then frankly, talking from the heart about what happened here, or what matters, or what difference this will make, often doesn't happen in a more Western and white kind of meeting environment. But if it does happen because because all the stars aligned and something so special happened for the group who was gathered, that kind of happens spontaneously. toward the end of the meeting. If you have a moment for reflection or a go around of some sort where people begin to actually reveal themselves a bit more or express a bit more vulnerability or heartfelt intentions. And it always feels so juicy and nice when that happens. But as I said, when I watched Hawaiians operate, like you didn't leave that to chance, like that was baked into the cake from the beginning. And it was facilitated in the way the meetings unfold. So I began to just regularly I began to develop an ethic for myself that said, there aren't a lot of rules about how I have to do things, even though I might have been trained in a way that said there are rules. They're good practice. And to the extent that practices I've learned make sense to me, but in this context, they may not, or they may need to be modified. So my twin ethics that I drive my decision-making from is to be culturally responsive and socially responsible. And sometimes those mean the same thing, but to me, they give me sort of two guardrails for thinking about what I'm doing. And it's like, how accessible have I made it for everyone in the room, no matter who they are? How easy is it for them to take that walk from their seat to the center, to have their voice registered and heard within the group? How easy is it, have I made it for them to participate fully? And on the social responsibility side, that brings up the question of righting unrightable wrongs. Have we engaged all of the appropriate stakeholders, and have we made space for the necessary conversations about what's driving people? And sometimes that's history, so rather than saying that's a bit beyond our agenda, so how can I attend in the way I do the work to make room for healing to happen, for people's needs to get met where there has been prior harm or where there is a structural injustice. So for many years, I've been working with the idea of looking at structures, inequalities, places where people's voices and choices have been shut out. And if you do organizational development work, that's a hierarchy. They're kind of built with that as an acceptable. That's not a what do they say? It's not a bug, it's a feature. And so I think there's been a lot of revisiting of, how do you modify sort of the structure of hierarchies that are built for order and control and efficiency, so that they're more built for community and creativity and connection. And I feel like one of the skill sets that we bring to the scene in organizations is that we help organizations understand how to hold both of those at the same time, how to be both a hierarchy, because that's how they're structured. It's sort of the spine of an organization. But then how do you build the heart of an organization in a way that lets other kinds of processes emerge and more lateral relationships to form between people and vulnerabilities to be given space for people to bring more of themselves to work, more of themselves to the job. And so I think about it that way. And so I started just designing, at first I started just redesigning my agendas when I had a large population of Hawaiians in my groups, or as they say here, local people, because that sort of Hawaiian sensibility kind of extends out to sort of create the dominant sensibility in the community. But I didn't do it when I was at the university, or I was in some kind of more corporate setting or a multi-stakeholder collaboration organized by nonprofits. Then I started thinking, what, as an homage to history here, and as, we can't fix what's happened with Hawaiians, but we can make it more hospitable for Hawaiians everywhere all the time. And to be honest with you, when I thought about how Hawaiians normally organize meetings and sort of have this soft and connected on-ramp to the work. And then I thought about the way we often do these meetings in these very cold and efficient ways. I thought, wow, if my predominant way of operating would be this more Hawaiian style, it would be so off-putting to have to spend my time in these meetings that weren't designed that way. I mean, without being crude, it kind of feels like, sex with no foreplay. That's kind of how I came to think about like how jarring that would be if you were never able to get your needs met for a sense of safety, connection, shared purpose before diving into the work. And so I just decided to start altering the way I do meetings all the time, no matter who's in the room, because while it might have been inspired by Hawaiian practices, it's really just more humanistic. It's more feminine, it's more female, it's more human, it's more humane. So I just stopped feeling apologetic about that and said, that's okay. I think this is the way I want to create events for people. And sometimes there are people for whom that way of operating might feel like, aren't we wasting time? Are we going to take that much time for introductions? And part of getting them to get comfortable with doing things in a slightly different way is also part of equalizing the power in the room, so that the people who are most used to having their needs, things designed for their sensibilities, agendas reflecting their sense of the priorities. It's a gentle but important reminder that you're not the only person in the room, and your needs aren't the only needs that matter. So we're going to do this in a way that's going to be create a better container for everyone to do what it is we've come here to do. So one of the ways is to sort of modify my practice in ways that feel culturally responsive and socially responsible. And in some cases, sort of moving away from some of the formal training I've received and challenging some of the assumptions of that.
So what would it look like? I mean, if you were to think, because I'm trying to imagine. I mean, you described what a setting in which it begins with food and so on. But what I'm curious about, is your role. How does your role change, if at all, given how you have adapted to and modified your approach based on your experience of being not just living in Hawaii, but being and working with people in that culture?
So some of the things were actually just a recovery of my fuller personality before professionalism tells you that leave that on the editing room floor, where you sort of maybe don't reveal. So here in Hawaii, I mean, it's funny because as I said to you, I was in Delaware before here, and I like Delaware very much, but it was a very white and corporate atmosphere. And I came from a coal mining town in Western Pennsylvania with in a large immigrant family among different groups of immigrants who all came to fill the mines. So Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Polish, so I had this sense of sameness and difference. And I had this sense of pride in that difference. And then when I went to Delaware, I felt like I had to tuck myself in, like take out the color, let go of details that make you not, it seems like, at a university, everybody sort of shows up acting like they've always been, middle class, or, like you all came from educated parents, or, I just had this tremendous sense of having to hide who I fully and really was in order to look like I belonged there. And then when I came to Hawaii, I just had the reverse experience, because the way people are here was much more familiar to the way I've grown up. And so I had to let more of myself be shown. I had to be more personable, connecting, less guarded, less formally professional. I didn't have to, but found myself using a lot more storytelling, the use of metaphor, imagery, art, nature, building those into design, having meetings outside, having artists come in and help us build things, and then we pass the piece of art we've built onto someone else and have them change it and watch our reaction to having our art changed. Just like my brain just became open to just sort of pulling in the arts, pulling in narrative, pulling in the past. I had to take risks. And I can remember really clearly, I started working with cross-cultural partners, because I felt like that made the work much stronger if we looked like the people we were meeting with in the room. And so I was partnering with a Hawaiian male. I had a Chinese female, and they're all Hawaii, they're all local, but they all bring a different characteristic. And here in Hawaii, people are very aware of these differences, and it's a source of pride and joy about these differences. So we brought those differences into the room and we reflected them back to people. And And that changed the way we worked because, we would be doing music. I had people dancing at one point, as in a change management kind of retreat. And then talking about what it's like to let somebody dip you and how much trust that takes. And I have to say that, back east, I probably wouldn't have risked some of those kinds of ideas. I also was saying, I remembered on the Big Island distinctly, being taught, we were about to start an intervention with an organization. It was a school, actually, a charter school. And we met with people as a kickoff one night, and we were going to sort of do the next 2 full days. And as we ended, some of the people in the group came up and had a relationship with the Hawaiian partner I was working with, had a sort of cousin. They were distant cousins and hadn't seen each other in a long time. And there was a really warm welcome and then an invitation to dinner. And my first reaction was like, we can't do that because we're here for a change process and there are parties involved and they have relationships with each other. And we can't show up tomorrow morning having spent the evening with one of the parties. Like, to me, it was just really clear. That was kind of a black and white, that I wasn't thinking was appropriate to step over that line. And the pushback to me was the people in the room who won't be at dinner, tonight with us would find it harder to explain why you wouldn't go to dinner with your cousins than that you did go to dinner with your cousins. Like, you will be more suspect tomorrow morning for having turned down the invitation.
Isn't that fascinating?
So this whole idea of standing behind role, professionalism and role, one of the things I have come to understand and believe is that people who have been through harm and for whom process, government, systems, and structures haven't served them well in their own experience, they're not interested in your neutrality. They're interested in your passion about right things happening. So while they may not want you to be partial to them, they want to know they have an advocate in the room for their concerns. And so they're not interested in your professionalism. They're not interested in your remoteness. They're not interested in your politeness. They want to know you. They want to know your honest reactions to things. And so just letting down your professional guard in that sense and being more revealed is really, really important to seeming real and trustworthy and getting buy-in from people, especially those who have been least well served. I'll give you a concrete example around an environmental issue I was dealing with here. There were kind of a group of people that were considered to be outliers to the process and hostile to the process, and they wanted in. And I had to fight for them to be able to be in because the group of players who were the power players were like, we don't want them in. I tried to help them understand the consequences of not letting them in. And in giving them the chance, in giving them the chance to come into the process, they didn't, I think there were phone interviews being done as intake for the different parties. And this particular party was a combination of conservation groups and Hawaiian activists. And they weren't interested in a phone conversation. They wanted me to drive to their house and spend the Saturday with them, like the whole day, listening to a very long history of these issues, looking at stacks and stacks of paper, and then taking the stacks and stacks of paper with me. And I didn't have a contract that was appropriate or even suggested it would be necessary to do that with all the parties. But it was clear to me that that felt necessary to this party. And so my old training would have said, I have to spend the same kind of time with everyone, if not the same amount of time, the same kind of context. I decided that wasn't true here. Drove to their house on a Saturday morning, spent the whole day with them, walked away with stacks of paper. That didn't happen with any other party. But in the end, it was important to getting them to be willing to engage the process the way we were hoping that they would engage it. And part of what they needed was a demonstration of my willingness to do more for them and with them than I was doing with others. And that is partly due to their experience that they're sort of the least voiced, the least powerful, the least validated in all of the processes that had led up to this. And so if I was going to win their support to come in and engage responsibly in what we were trying to do, I had to earn that. And sometimes earning that meant doing things that I haven't done with others. And that was a big difference here from the way I was practicing before. And I'll give you one last example because I think it's really goes to the specifics. I did a meeting out in the middle of the Pacific, bringing the United States, US territories, and those beyond the US territories that are out in the Pacific, like CNMI and others who share environmental concerns, but for whom political boundaries and funding borders are separate. And I had done a number of meetings of this sort in one issue or another, from coral reefs to, whales, other sorts of things going on here. And one of the things that came up is that there was reluctance on the part of some of the countries and territories further out into the Pacific of coming together, which often happens. Like federal agency will call these meetings, people travel great distances, they spend several days together. There's an analysis of the issues, there's a discussion of the possible solutions, and then they usually ended up with some kind of articulation of the need for a secretariat, a budget, some kind of structure within the government that would be inside an agency, that would have money, that would have leadership. And one of the things that I became aware of was the depths of resentment that had come about from people that participate in those conversations, but then don't receive a check because they're not part of America's responsibility. So they bring their science, they bring their knowledge, they bring their ideas, and then we form solutions, but they're standing outside while the solutions are either, often those solutions are too heavy structurally to really stand up and make any difference. But even when they do, there's an inequity of who is able to be served by those solutions. And having become more and more aware of both the heavy structure that comes out of these meetings that often never gets legs and the inequities of that reality, I decided that I was going to take a risk with the funder in DC and say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that again. And it was like, well, what are we going to do? And I was like, well, I have ideas about what we could do to sort of address that. And they gave me permission to do it. And so we actually did some social justice experiences where we gave people the direct experience of being tasked to do the same thing. But some of the groups were really well resourced, given adequate time and plenty of support, small numbers to put their heads together. Other groups were large, in less accommodating space, had fewer resources to do the task, had people kind of like scolding them and challenging them about how they're using their time. And then when they came back to show their work, not realizing they were having different experiences, they had a personal experience of the story of what it's like to be on the short end of the stick, on resources, power, voice, and support for the hard things we're all trying to do. That created a context for conversation about wanting to do things differently. And then we began, in the course of the work we were there to do, to actually open up a conversation, which I know felt risky to people, but the question was, what has happened in the past that, if this is going to be successful, needs to no longer happen in the future? And so people went into their own little groups. So these little island, these territories, these separate countries, they had an honest conversation among themselves about those patterns that needed to be disrupted and new ways of practicing with each other that needed to be efforted. And so some of these folks were having the opportunity to tell some very highly positioned people in Washington and in the Western region here in California the truth about how collaboration feels sometimes in these settings, and the difference that needed to happen if something new and different was going to occur so that you didn't end up in the same place. And as a result of that, all of that preparation, at some point when they went to sort of form a solution, somebody from the islands stood up and said, I think what we need, and they used a metaphor. They said, what we need to build is a boat that can carry all of us, that is light, big enough to carry all of us, light enough to move quickly, runs on something really inexpensive, so it requires very little fuel. So they kind of created an image of a solution in terms of its critical attributes. And from that shared vision, given that that would address the inequalities of the past and rebalance things in this moment and take into consideration everyone's needs and everyone's strengths, that everybody had something to contribute. They used that metaphor and they built a solution that did not create a giant secretariat infrastructure, that did not need a ton of money, that was able to be implemented sort of at a peer-to-peer level in many ways. And I have heard, I haven't checked lately, but 10 years later, that what came out of that, the network of shared engagement and shared responsibility for that issue was still operating. And so, taking the risk to interrupt the storylines, to tell the truth, to make people feel seen and heard for the challenges of the past, and then to hold leaders to account for things being different. I have found way more confidence and courage to do that, maybe because I'm way out here in the middle of the Pacific and nobody else is really looking at what I'm doing, because I've often wondered if what I was doing under close inspection by the field would be found wanting or inappropriate or too risky. But for me, it's what felt necessary and fruitful. And it's been so much fun. And I think in many ways, the times I've taken the most risk and gone the most off-road from my formal training is when I've been able to have the greatest impact and have the greatest learnings for myself.
How do you know how to do that? How do you know when to take a risk, when to open up, when to be vulnerable, when to adjust, to honor the traditions that you came from, but at the same time, understand that there are other traditions that have been less honored and that are just as valuable, and in fact, more valuable to the people you're working with than the traditions you came from. How do you know how to make those calls and make those decisions? That's amazing to me to think about. I mean, the results, yes, that's extraordinary to hear that story. And in that story about working with the different countries and territories in the Pacific, incorporated what you talked about earlier, and that is the value of storytelling that brings the past into the present in a way that isn't just a complaint. It isn't just a recitation of history, but it's using the history to inform the decisions that are being made today. I mean, that's one of the pieces that you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation that was so different for you, that was important for you and different for you in moving to Hawaii and how it affected your practice. But it's just fascinating to think about how to imagine how you think through those extraordinary decisions.
I think I actually might have an insight about where that comes from. And well, first, I think I'm a creative thinker and I never do anything the same way twice. So I don't like a recipe and I don't want a plan handed to me. So it's just my own nature to sort of be inventing stuff. But before, I would have run into my self-judgment, like, oh, that's too far out there, or that's asking the power players to be most uncomfortable because it's not what they're familiar with. But, I guess part of the courage and the confidence around what I would describe as making design choices, right? This really comes down to design. I was a teacher first. And as a teacher, you have a lot of control over how information is going to be shared and the kind of experiences that students are going to be taken through. I taught at both the university level and adults, and I also taught in K-12 schools. And so I've always said that I don't know how I would ever facilitate. I think of this may offend some, I don't know, but I think of mediation as playing straight melody, like classically trained. And I think of facilitation like jazz. There are fewer rules, there's less structure, and you have less recognized authority for anything within the group, right? Nobody's deferring to you. You have to earn that. And so when I think about that, I think about the challenge of designing and improvising. And so I feel like, having been a teacher, and what I was starting to say is, I often wonder how people who haven't been a teacher do this work, because designing a process, like maybe a year-long, multi-staged, multi-phase, multi-event process, is sort of like designing a unit. You know, they would say in like a course, and then there are units, and then there are lessons, right? So this is sort of this is like breaking down the big goal into its component pieces, and then recognizing that not every student in the class has the same prior knowledge about something. So we're gonna have to do some co-learning together to bring everybody up to speed about the topic we're here to discuss. So I'm very comfortable designing co-learning opportunities within the work so that everybody's on the same page about essential knowledge. As a teacher and as someone who, you know, really believes in sort of holistic learning, people have to touch it, smell it, you know, see it, say it. So I'm comfortable designing small group experiences and large group experiences that have people encounter each other and the content in different ways, because I know how helpful that is to both building connection and building learning. So I think that in many ways, the answer to your question is, I got the confidence from being a teacher first, and teachers are designers, and designers of diverse needs toward a shared goal. And so I bring all the permission that you give yourself in teaching to the design of facilitative processes around what they need. And because I'm not designing I guess part of it too is, that's the second thing I'd say, is I'm very clear about my intentions. My intentions are not to facilitate an event or to deliver a training. My intentions are to help people take a step further down a path towards some intended outcome or change that they seek. John Paul Lederach was one of the very earliest trainings I ever went to when he was at Eastern Mennonite University, and he was teaching the elicitive model of training. And he taught, you know, something that I was already doing, and I was just so happy to see someone with such a, you know, such credibility, sort of doing things that I was intuitively or naively doing. And that was sort of never designing this moment, this event, as if at the end of it, that's our goal. It's like, it's connected to it's a much bigger goal that's further in time. And this is the stepping stone toward that. So you're designing this with that goal in mind. And so as really a change, probably I'm most concerned about change management and how people are brought through change experiences. So I find that permission to design for where they're trying to get to rather than where they are is something they need help thinking through, because it's scary for people. They're already kind of overwhelmed with where they are, let alone where they're trying to get to. So I try to hold the bigger picture in mind and design for that bigger picture, so that like things snap together, like this will snap together with this, will snap together with that. There's several more steps before you ever get there, but I want these things to all make sense in light of one another. So it's a permission I give myself with design. And then it's those twin ethics of saying, how can I do this in a way that's culturally responsive so that everybody feels welcome, everybody feels included, everybody feels special, everybody feels like they have something to share and say, and that it's safe enough to do that. And then where is the social responsibility here? Will this money be well spent? Will they get where they're trying to go? Will this change structural impediments to fairness, to voice, to, you know, anything that's going to get in the way of sustainability? And frankly, I think any sort of dysfunctional dynamic where there's an imbalance of power, the suppression of voice, all of those things that can happen in an organization or even in a family, in a group, in my opinion, that elevates it to an issue of social responsibility, because if it can't be sustained, then this wasn't a success.
Right.
So I'm challenging people about things that they've grown comfortable with because it's how it's always done. And we've never dealt with that before. And I'm saying, well, I'd like to suggest we should deal with that now. I'd like to suggest, how could we deal with that problem in this context? You know, even something as simple as secretaries don't get to be part of conversations about strategic planning. It's like, why? Why is that? And, you know, a client might say to me, but we don't do that. And I'm like, well, let's talk about why you don't do that. And let's talk about whether you should do that. So I've always been bold enough to feel as though the righteous cause that I'm there to serve of, you know, culturally responsive and socially responsible gives me permission to take risks. And honestly, the reason I feel, I know this, the reason I feel comfortable to do that is that I've never been willing to take responsibility for anyone else. So I can always walk away. If the context of a case or a job I'm being asked to do feels as though they're asking me not to go there or to not work in ways that feel like they're what feels responsible to me, responsive and responsible. And so I try really hard up front to negotiate with people an understanding of how I work and the kinds of things that we're going to like deal with along the way that might be beyond the scope of what they had imagined, and whether or not they're okay with that and how that would go. And assuming that they're comfortable, we go down that road together. And having negotiated that up front, if I feel like I'm in a situation where somebody's asking me to do something that doesn't feel culturally responsive or socially responsible, that's time for renegotiating my involvement, because I'm able to do that. No one's my boss and no one's depending on me for income. So I'm free to make choices that feel really right to me. And that's given me a chance to just keep having more and more chance to practice.
Yeah, but that's the easy part. The easy part is to say, no one else is responsible. I don't have to pay the bills for anybody else. I don't have to look out for anyone else. The really hard decisions are the ones you're talking about, which is put all of those practicalities aside. It really comes down to ethics.
It really does.
It really fundamentally comes down to what you believe is appropriate for your role. And each of us has that. We don't often acknowledge it in the way, and I am so appreciative of how clear you have been about what are the ethical boundaries within which you work, recognizing that they are a little bit fluid because you have to take into account who you're working with and their needs and their cultures and their requirements and so on. Just as, you know, before, your ethics would have said, no, 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 I'm not going to that person's house and sit with them on a Saturday and listen to their stories. No, I wouldn't have, you know, but you recognize, you know, and I think that's really, really important, because otherwise we do get ourselves into very difficult situations because we haven't established our own ethic. And our own ethic is part of what is used to make the contract upfront.
I think you're just right about that. And you're reminding me that, you know, even though I've reduced down my ethics to these two twin ethics I talk about now, they are, I don't speak about those two ethics with clients. Those are internal barometers for me. What I do speak about with clients, when I said to you, I negotiate up front how this is going to go if you're working with me. And I couch it, I have, back when you met me, back when I was in Delaware, and I started that center, I needed to know who I wanted to say yes to and who I wanted to say no to, because I was a one-woman shop for serving a state, small state, but a whole state. And I had hope that we would be popular. So I had such a commitment to wanting to see what conflict resolution skills would look like when they are saturated in an education system, from the way kids handle their own disputes through, you know, curriculum programs and peer mediation, but how teachers teach, whether they use cooperative versus competitive learning strategies, how teachers work with each other in their own collaboration efforts, designing curriculum, how they work with families and parents in resolving issues or making parents feel part of the school, how the school board operates. You know, so my vision was to see what it would look like if you had a system that everyone had these skills in education. And that was my first and great passion. But in order to know what to say yes and no to, because at the time there was a flood of conflict resolution money hitting schools for peer mediation. And there were a lot of calls for peer mediation. And I had decided early on that I didn't want to do peer mediation with kids. I would only help build peer mediation programs with kids if there was adequate adult buy-in to the need for that, not just a teacher sponsor who we know is going to get pregnant in 5 years and then leave and the program will flounder, right? So I wanted this to be a broadly held value for the school. And I wanted all of the, I wanted all the adults, but at least all of the adults who would be working with the kids that we were going to reach to be given the skills and training, because I thought kids shouldn't be asked to do what adults won't. They should have adults around them who can reinforce, model, and encourage practice of these skills when I was gone. And so thinking about my long-term impact and desire for this, I started figuring out how to articulate my needs around all this while making it feel as though I was articulating their needs. And so I have these 5 principles of practice, which I will share with you because I still get reactions from people. They're like 30 years old now. I still use them. And if I ever do a job and I don't articulate these 5 and get them negotiated with someone, I'm always sorry. It only happens rarely, but it has. I say to people, look, there are a lot of people who do what I can do. We're all different. We all work different ways. Let me tell you a bit about how I work and we can figure out whether it would be a good fit. And the things about the way I work, why they're here, is because if I'm going to work with you, I really want you to be successful, because your success is my success. And I've come to believe that there are 5 conditions that help us ensure success. And if we can either have these before we begin or pursue these as part of what we're doing, we increase the chances of success. So let me tell you what they are. And then let me give you some names of other people that would do the same job for you, but in a different way. They may not have a set of conditions that they need. So let me run them by you. And the first one is participation in any planning, collaborative planning or training has to be voluntary. Everyone in the room has to have chosen to be there. Second one, whatever we do has to be customized for this setting. I don't have anything on a shelf. There's nothing in a box. I'm not going to do the same thing with you that I've done with anybody else, because you're not the same as anybody else. What we do should be connected to where you've just been or what you last did, either in training or organizational development or strategic planning. Like, let's not forget where you were last, because the people in the room won't. They'll wonder what happened with the feedback they gave you, the last plan, how this builds on the last training. So I want to connect what we're doing with where you've been, and I want it to connect with where you're going so that we can put this in a context for people and it can seem meaningful. The third one is it should be built for longevity. We should only do things that make sense to do because they can survive without me when I'm gone. So have we built it with enough integrity that it can grow legs and begin to walk around? Whether that's enough people having skills, or there's a plan with a stewardship plan for who's going to manage the strategic plan going forward, and how's that going to happen? So I'm going to be asking the hard questions about, so what happens when leadership changes, when I'm gone? Well, what's the plan around that? And we're going to design for it. The fourth one is it should be data informed, because too often people, think they know there's a problem when they haven't really checked that out. Or they base their plans on the 3 people they spoke to, like a leader who consulted a few people and said, I think what we need to do is X. It's like, let's vet that. Or they're trying to build something that someone else has already built. And it's like, well, have you looked at what others have done? And how can we expedite and economize this thing by looking at best practices that are already out there, rather than thinking you're rebuilding the wheel? So sometimes my role is to introduce or recognize the need for data, need for information, the need for alternatives, and to encourage where that falls in the process. And the last one, I used to say, because it was always in schools when I started this, that whatever we do needs to be in the best interest of kids. This is the ethics trump card. But then as I moved out of school settings, I would start to say it needs to be in the best interest of the community that this group exists to serve. So not the people in the conversation, but the people for whom the conversation is being had. And that gives me the chance to challenge who's not at the table, who isn't sufficiently voiced, who doesn't have the necessary resources to engage, whether or not the technologies we're using sort of create a bias about who we'll hear from and won't. And it also gave me the opportunity in schools to address things like, structured racial injustice. So if you had a group of kids that were having fights in the playground and somebody got a grant and said, hey, can you come and help teach these kids conflict resolution skills because they're fighting every lunchtime. And when I find out a little bit more about what the fight is about, they seem to be around race lines. And the fights have something to do with the context of race and how it's being treated. My suspicion is that those kids that problem cannot easily be solved by those children alone on a playground. But there's something happening in that school setting that's contributing to the sense of division and difference. And that if we're going to deal with that and what's happening on the playground, we need to deal with the context in which it's coming from. And so that gives me permission to sort of make, blow the problem up bigger, to sort of get to its root. And, when I say to people, if everyone participates voluntarily, if it's customized, if it's built for longevity, if it's informed with the right information, and we do it with the right spirit of who it's meant to serve, so that we do no harm, I can guarantee you I'm going to get in here like neck deep with you and we're going to make this a success. But I'm going to ask you to try and help create these conditions. And I can just give you an example. In schools, when I started doing trainings for in-service days, as they call it, no teacher is, for the most part, ever given a choice about whether to participate in one of those trainings, what those trainings are, whether those trainings feel like they're appropriate or necessary. So I formed a whole process of getting whole school buy-in that violated the culture of schools and the hierarchy, which is we don't give teachers a choice in that. And I'm saying to them, if you want to work with me, I'll help you come up with a way that we can give teachers enough information about what we were offering so that they could make a choice about participating. And then we'll work with those who choose. And, for principals, it's like, that's really complicated. That's not how we do it. And I'm saying, I can give you names of people that will come in and do just what you're asking. But if you want to work with me, we're going to motivate these people to want to be in here. And, and so just those little terms of engagement for me become leverage points for negotiating the conditions I feel like are necessary to live out the ethics that we were just talking about.
What and we're getting sort of near time when we'll stop. And there are two things. One, I want to make an observation and then ask a question. And the observation is for anybody looking at this. I talk all the time about how critical it is to know why we're making the choices that we make, whether it's in a small claims mediation or it's in a multi-stakeholder long-term intervention. It's why do you choose to do X versus Y, Z, or anything else? And it requires that we know enough about what we believe, what we value, what our influences are, what shapes our thinking. And you have just, in the hour that we've spent talking, you have given somebody who wonders about that notion about belief shaping action. You have shown them exactly how it's done, because you haven't just talked about some extraordinarily fascinating interventions, but you've explained why you made the decision to act in the way that you did. And it is so valuable to be able to hear that. It enriches the conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad you feel that way.
Oh, absolutely, Marina. This has been beyond the extraordinarily high expectation I already had for our conversation. But before we end, is there something that either I could have asked you or that you would like to talk about before we finish our time today?
I think this feels like a good ending, but what I'm laughing at is, you and I had a conversation about what I might talk about, and I haven't talked about that at all.
I know you haven't.
I guess all I would say is maybe I would leave a placeholder or put a pin in what I thought I was going to talk about, is that I've come to be very intrigued with all of the brain science that's out now about our response, the body's response to stress, challenge, conflict, trauma, and how it's made me aware of why, when conflict resolution works, why it works so well, because it's responsive to all of that, new evidence and knowledge about how our brains operate. And conflict resolution provides tools for working with that reality as you work through issues. So it makes me ever more confident about how smart these skills are and the services that people who have these skills provide and how important they are. But what I've really begun to get really interested in focusing on is something that I feel I've always tried in my trainings to spend a lot of time on. But since most people I know don't spend a lot of time on this, I was always feeling a little bit guilty that, God, why did it take you so long to get to the skills? Because I do this piece that I call preheating the oven, which is kind of really what you're talking about, like building someone's internal sense of motivation, alignment with ethics around why they would do this crazy hard thing of regulating their emotion and managing their skills at a time when they feel least inclined to do that. It's kind of, it's kind of superhuman what we're asking people to do, to take the moments they feel least mindful and to engage in the most mindful way. And I've come over time to really believe that conflict resolution is a moving meditation, that it is a mindfulness practice that is achieving just what mindfulness is meant to give you: awareness, more full awareness of what's going on, compassion, being able to access compassion for yourself and others, and discernment to know what to do, right? So what I've come to is that there is a step before listening. For many people, when they learn conflict resolution or they engage in the conflict resolution process, they think the place that it begins is with listening. And I believe now that there's a really, really critical first step that's super important, and it has skills involved in it. It requires some time, and it's preparatory for everything else to be successful. And I'm referring to it as the pause. I believe that there is a moment of engaging, doing emotion regulation, engaging your body, your mind, and your spirit, calling on your greater angels, your higher purpose, your ancestors, your God, to assist you in what you're about to do, checking in with your body, to be aware of where you're holding stress and letting it go and relaxing, creating a feeling of being safe, doing the reflecting that needs to be done about what is this conflict about for me? What is it I'm needing out of it? What are my interests here? And what ways can I nurture those needs myself? And where I can't, who do I need to speak to about what and how? And so I really feel like there's an opportunity here for us to tease out that internal process, that if you're going to engage conflict resolution or conflict or group collaborative processes more effectively, letting people do the interior work necessary to bring themselves fully to the process with more awareness, compassion, and introspection about what their needs are, is a critically important set of skills that we can and should be teaching people. And so I'm redesigning my work to make that a more obvious and important aspect of preparing people to be competent so that they can be confident when conflict arises, so that they can be courageous. Because I really believe that what conflict resolution positions us to do is to be courageous around speaking up on behalf of ourselves or causes and others that we care about. But we're not going to be courageous, appropriately so, if we don't have confidence that what we're about to do will be helpful. And we're not going to be confident, appropriately so, if we don't have some baseline of competence about what these skills and techniques are. And so I feel really strongly that the moment is upon us, that public interest is growing, the need is evident, and this is our moment. This is the moment that conflict resolution practitioners and others have been waiting for. I think the world is catching up with us, and now our job is to keep up with them. But I do think that what we're asking people to do has to be recognized as a really high order emotional mastery moment of turning stress, what would be a normal fight, flight, or freeze moment, into engaging the entire prefrontal cortex and bringing back empathy, compassion, consequential thinking, critical problem solving. All of that is, you can't access all of that unless you are sufficiently confident and calm that you're going to be okay, that the tiger's not going to eat you. And our general reaction to conflict is the tiger's going to eat us. So we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And so how do we help people, recognize that tendency and then do the phenomenally more than human thing of overcoming it? And I believe that the way we overcome that is by packaging some sets of experiences that bring people to mindfulness in the moment before they engage with others in the conflict. And that's the pause. And that's where I've got a lot of energy and interest right now.
We're going to stop there because it's a perfect moment to end with me and everyone who's viewing this saying, and what's next?
Great.
So what next will be part 2 when we can schedule that.
That would be awesome. That would be
Marina,
awesome. This was really fun.
This has been great. I'm going to end now and thank you for this time that we've had together. For me personally, I just feel so selfish to have had you for however long it's been, an hour or so, to myself, and grateful that we'll be able to share this with others as well. So thank you.
Can I tell you something 1 second? Or do you have to stop this right this second?
Oh.
I just wanted to say, I don't know that I would have ever recognized myself as a reflective practitioner or someone that had something of value beyond my own entertaining myself if it weren't for you and a very small handful of people. And I encountered you early enough in my career where I was making stuff up to serve the needs that I was trying to address, really not knowing what I was doing or having a sense of who I should be following. And I believe you heard me talk about that at a public at a conference, and you were accomplished, seasoned, had so much to share and so much knowledge already. And just that mentoring of saying, you've got something here, had a really big part in my pausing and saying, do I have something here to contribute? And so I just want to thank you for both, it's kind of like full circle. You were there at the very beginning and here you are at this current moment in time as I feel like I'm transitioning to something. And I just want to thank you again for giving me that mirror that says, you have something meaningful to say and I want to hear it. And that is such a huge gift to give anybody. And I want to thank you for giving it to me.
Thank you, Marina. We'll stop there. This could go on, but I think we'll stop. Thank you.